Hey guys, it's Libby, and this is a video response to Kalanadi's recent wrap-up video for the first week of December. I think that the books she talked about in that video were the highest percentage of books that I had also read. So normally I don't do video responses to just wrap-ups, and YouTube doesn't make it very convenient to do video responses anymore, blah. But I had so many thoughts, mostly about Merchant of Venice. Like, literally the night after I watched her video, I could not sleep. I was awake at 3 a.m. just thinking about the Merchant of Venice. And it's not my favorite Shakespeare play, that would be Measure for Measure, but it may be the Shakespeare play that I have the most thoughts about. And I probably should have scripted this video, but I never script videos, and it will be particularly obvious now, because I think I have an argument, but there's gonna be a bunch of random tangents, because there have been so many different threads of Merchant of Venice that have been weaving their way into my life. Rachel's video, which of course I will link in the description. I also volunteer as an usher at 2 Shakespeare theaters in Washington, D.C., and the Folger Theater, one of the places where I volunteer, recently showed, they didn't do a production of Merchant of Venice, but they did a screening of a film of a play of the Merchant of Venice that the Royal Shakespeare did at Athens. Athens? Well, I've been talking about Greek tragedy too much. At Stratford. I should have scripted this video. And then also, I work with the Online Stage, which makes public domain recordings of plays, and I am editing their production of The Merchant of Venice, and I'm also playing Jessica, which I had just recorded the day before. So I sort of got the play from Jessica's perspective. She is the daughter of Shylock, who leaves him to go marry a Christian. And then I'd seen the whole play, and then Rachel was talking about it and how she didn't like it, kind of, and I was like, okay, it is time. It is time to have a big ramble about The Merchant of Venice. So I have my Yale Shakespeare edition here. I have dog-eared some pages and underlined some lines. Let's get down to it. And also, Rachel said that she does not like to read Shakespeare plays to analyze them very deeply. I apologize, because that is what I am about to do. So first off, you say that this play is anti-Semitic. Now, much ink has been spilled over this, and I think I'm kind of on the side of it not being anti-Semitic, at least sort of at its core, at its essence. It may have been performed in an anti-Semitic way, but I think the modern thought process is that writing belongs to the readers, not to the authors, and not to the original audience or the intended audience, but whoever the audience is now. So bearing that in mind, The Merchant of Venice is definitely a play with anti-Semitic characters, but it's not clear that Shakespeare was writing an anti-Semitic play. The 2 characters who sort of express the most anti-Semitism are Salarino and Antonio, who is the Merchant of Venice. And Salarino actually gets the "hath not a Jew eyes" speech delivered to him, which kind of shuts him up. In Act 3, Scene 1, there's a sort of heated exchange going on between Salarino and Solanio, who are Christian Italians, and Shylock, the Jewish Italian. But then after the "hath not a Jew eyes" speech, Salarino just sort of tries to change the subject. Like, a new person enters and he's like, I'm talking to you because I can't really answer that. And then with Antonio, I think the real crux of this play is the dispute between Antonio and Shylock. And there's romances and stuff and whatever. You can get that in any old Shakespeare comedy. But I don't think that Antonio and Shylock hate each other on religious grounds or even on sort of ethno-cultural grounds. First off, the play is called The Merchant of Venice. It could have had a bunch of other titles. It could have been the Three Caskets. It could have been Shylock the Jew. There were a bunch of options for other names. But he chose The Merchant of Venice. And merchant means we're talking about buying and selling. We're talking about economics. And in this period in history in Italy, the Catholic Church had forbidden people to lend money with interest. So you could give someone money, but you couldn't charge interest. That was a sin. So a bunch of the people who lived in Jewish communities in Western European cities, they would become basically loan officers because they didn't listen to what the Catholic Church said. So Shylock is one of these usurers, and his livelihood is making loans and living off of the interest from them. Antonio, on the other hand, is just kind of a rich guy and will lend out money with no interest, which means that he is a threat to Shylock's livelihood. And so even though religion is kind of at the foundation of their dislike of each other, it's not the way it's actually expressed. And if I may quote a little bit, Shylock says the first time we see him in a scene with Antonio, he says, "I hate him for he is a Christian, but more for that in low simplicity he lends out money gratis and brings down the rate of usance here with us in Venice." That was in Act 1, Scene 3. And then at the beginning of the Hath Not a Jew I speech, he says, "He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000. I'm not totally sure what the line "he hath hindered me 500,000 means. Yale Shakespeare doesn't have a lot of notes, but Rachel, I noticed that you had the Folger edition, so if there's a note on what that means, please let me know. "He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains." A lot of these are economic terms. Thwarted my bargains, me referring to how Antonio would often give people who couldn't pay back their debts to Shylock money. And then the place where this gets to be sort of complicated is in the courtroom scene, Act 4, Scene 1. I think Shakespeare went a little bit overboard with the sort of bloodthirstiness that Shylock has. I think there could have been one less exchange where Bassanio and his friends offer even more money to Shylock than what he was owed, and he refused it. That happens like a bunch of times, like 3 at least, I think. And I also think that they didn't need the lines where Portia says, "Are you gonna like call the surgeon so that Antonio's wounds can be staunched?" And Shylock's like, "No, I'm not. I don't have to." We could have just cut that, and because Shylock or Antonio could have lived if he had a doctor there afterwards after he had a pound of flesh cut out, but without a surgeon he was pretty much definitely going to die. And then the whole courtroom scene can be seen as a commentary on religion for a play where the religion of the characters is quite a big deal. There's not a lot of actual discussion of religion. I think the only direct time that they really talk about it is in a scene with Jessica, Lancelot Gobbo, and Lorenzo, which is basically just building up to a joke about how if you make more people Christian, you will raise the price of pork. But the courtroom scene, if you want to view it allegorically, is about weighing between justice and mercy. And justice is what is demanded by Shylock, and also demanded by the Old Testament God / Yahweh / the God that Shylock believes in. And then Portia is representing mercy. She does this whole speech about mercy, and mercy is what is offered to us by Jesus Christ in the New Testament. So it's a very Old Testament versus New Testament sort of scene. So make of that what you will. I know that in modern productions, people are not playing Shylock the way he probably originally would have been portrayed, which is either as like a scheming villain or as like a clown. I've heard some people say, but The Merchant of Venice already has a clown, Lancelot Gobbo, and Shakespeare, a couple of his plays have 2 comic relief characters, but very few. I think maybe it's just All's Well That Ends Well. Although I have noticed that in several modern productions and productions that are set in the modern day, Shylock still has a really thick accent, which I don't think he needs, because he's not an immigrant. He's like lived in Venice his whole life, one assumes. And they also usually don't portray Jessica with a heavy accent. So if I was directing A Merchant of Venice, I would just let the guy playing Shylock talk however he normally talks. And then, of course, skewing off to one side a bit, if we want to talk about the way people would have perceived characters in Shakespeare's time, we have to talk about Antonio and whether or not he was coded gay. Because Jews were not really liked by Shakespeare's audience, neither really were gay people. Although there are gay characters that were presented in sort of a historical context at this time. Aufidius in Coriolanus is pretty clearly gay, and then Christopher Marlowe's play Edward II is about a gay relationship, and it's very clear. Christopher Marlowe, incidentally, wrote another play called The Jew of Malta, which is like really disgustingly anti-Semitic, way worse than The Merchant of Venice. However, he also wrote a play called Tamburlaine, actually like two plays, Tamburlaine Part 1 and Tamburlaine Part 2, where Tamburlaine, who has bested all of these mortal kings, is finally killed by the power of Allah because he dared to burn the Quran. Not totally sure what that means about Marlowe and his thoughts on religion, but interesting. So, Antonio. In modern productions, if they're setting it in modern times, all of the productions I've seen, actually I've only seen two, but one of them, it's pretty clear that Antonio is in love with Bassanio, and Bassanio is maybe aware of this, but doesn't requite it, and there's actually a little bit of disgustingness in Bassanio. I really don't like Bassanio. In that he's maybe taking advantage of Antonio in order to win Portia. And then in the production that I saw that was screened at the Folger, a production by the Royal Shakespeare Company, Antonio is clearly gay, is having a relationship with Bassanio. He actually delivers his first speech not to his friends, but to the audience with no one else on stage, and like tears are running down his face. And then Bassanio enters and they kiss. And there definitely is justification for this in the text, to the point where if you're going to set it in a modern context, it's really hard to make that just a platonic relationship. I'm going to read to you a little bit from Act 4, Scene 1. Antonio, when he's about to die, says, "Commend me to your honorable wife. Tell her the process of Antonio's end. Say how I loved you. Speak me fair in death. And when the tale is told, bid her be judge whether Bassanio had not once a love." And then Bassanio responds, "Antonio, I am married to a wife which is as dear to me as life itself, but life itself, my wife, and all the world are not with me esteemed above thy life. I would lose all, I sacrifice them all, here to this devil to deliver you." Antonio literally says, "I love you." And Bassanio actually uses language very similar to Aufidius in Coriolanus when he makes his declaration of love to Caius Marcius, which is to say, I have a wife, I love her, but I value you more. And then a little Easter egg, if you are totally obsessed with this play, is in the caskets, the 3 caskets that you have to choose the right one in order to prove that you are worthy to be Portia's husband, this trial set up by Portia's father. And the right casket, the lead casket, its inscription is, who chooseth me must give and hazard all he hath. And if you choose this one, it means that you are truly capable of love. And the person who gives and hazards all he hath for another person is Antonio for Bassanio. Bassanio never does that for Portia, and Portia doesn't really do that for Bassanio. And the other lovers, Jessica and Lorenzo, and Nerissa and Graziano. Jessica maybe a little bit in that she's leaving her whole family behind, but she's also kind of saving her soul by becoming a Christian, at least in the context of the play. Like, the true love in this play is between Antonio and Bassanio, at least by that judgment. Okay, I think that's all I have to say on that. So I have 3 minutes of battery left. I may have to stop and charge some more depending on how quickly I can finish this up. But finally, one thing that I noticed particularly, because you, Rachel, said that you had read this alongside The Winter's Tale, in a Shakespeare binge. Woot, Shakespeare binge. Everyone should have a Shakespeare binge. I started to realize that a lot of Shakespeare's sort of darker comedies, most of which are his sort of later romances, but Merchant of Venice certainly qualifies as one of his darker comedies, a lot of them are about what does it take to be forgiven. The Merchant of Venice answers this with, you need to be forgiven by a good-hearted Christian. Shylock is incapable of forgiveness for Antonio because he is Jewish. Maybe there's some anti-Semitism there. Portia and the Duke of Venice are also sort of interested in justice rather than mercy, when Shylock is the one who needs mercy. But Antonio doesn't really accept their conditions, and he totally ignores Graziano, who is sort of demanding that Shylock commit suicide. And Antonio at least allows him to have a livable life. This sort of thing is very similar to what happens in Measure for Measure, when your life depends on the person that you have most wronged. It's also in A Winter's Tale. Leontes is able to earn forgiveness through long years of suffering with the knowledge of what he has done and how bad it was. The Tempest is also kind of about this. It says that the way you earn forgiveness is to become completely in the power of the person you have wronged. And I think Cymbeline might touch on this too, with the whole situation with the queen, although I really don't know that much about Cymbeline. So Rachel, my suggestion for you, if you want to sort of round out this Shakespeare binge with looking at what it takes to be forgiven, I would definitely suggest reading Measure for Measure. I would also suggest that everyone read Measure for Measure for just any reason, because it's an excellent play. So that's all I have to say about Shakespeare. Also, you're reading The 13th Tale! Yay, 13th Tale! It's one of my favorite books. Have you read Bellman and Black, Diane Setterfield's other book? It largely got panned, but I think that's because people were expecting a second 13th Tale, and it's very different, but it's also very good. So that's all I have for now, and my cat is attacking a plastic bag, so I have to go.